Welcome to my TED Talk on why I think people commit crimes and how necessity affects that. So, the question at hand, how does necessity affect the benefits and consequences that individuals weigh when deciding whether or not to commit a crime? As a general theory of criminology, I use rational choice theory as a basis. I believe that humans think rationally and weigh the benefits and consequences of their actions before they actually perform them. This may look like, will I be caught doing something bad? Is the punishment too great for doing something bad? Or is the outcome good enough that I will ignore the possible consequences? We've been thinking this way for thousands of years. Aristotle quotes, "Every art and every inquiry, and similarly, every action and choice is thought to aim at some good. And for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim, in Nicomachean Ethics." What Aristotle is getting at is that for all of our actions, somewhere in the horizon is an intention of good, whether selfish or not. So if an individual were to deem that their action would bring more good than bad, or at least more good than the alternatives, they will take that option. In crime, this may look something like somebody deeming that committing a crime will bring more good than the badness that being caught brings, or the poor man deeming that it's more good to steal bread to feed his family than it is to let them go hungry. But sometimes it's not about whether or not an action brings more or less good. Sometimes we have to make a rational decision over what is necessary. Take Kravchov v. Canada, for example. Pavel Kravchov was an immigrant who came to Canada in 1993. He was eventually deported for a slew of crimes, including forgery, auto theft, and carrying illegal weapons. But he argued that his actions were out of necessity, as he was using the money he made to pay for treatment for the hepatitis B and C he had discovered he had. As a more general example, shoplifting is a crime often motivated by necessity, with one of the leading motivations being poverty, where people cannot afford or do not have access to necessary items, and thus they resort to stealing them. Both Kravkov and shoplifters motivated by crime have rationally deemed that committing an act of crime was better than doing nothing, as it was, or at least perceived to be, a necessity. In Canada, necessity is usually seen as a result of poverty. Vitana.org states, "Being in poverty often leads to high levels of stress. An overwhelming desire to meet certain basic needs becomes the highest priority. Over time, if those needs cannot be met, then some individuals will commit robberies, burglaries, and other forms of them. It can also lead to violent acts, though in the minds of the perpetrator, the actions are seen as a method of self-defense." Social conflict theory attributes both crime and poverty to class struggles. In particular, the struggles between the minority upper class and the lower and middle class that serve them. The upper class, as the ones currently in power, enact law and policy that exploit the lower and middle class. This exploitation most commonly takes the form of economic inequalities that drain the lower and middle class of their wealth, leading to poverty. In Canada, I believe that one of the best examples of these policies is our tax system. On YouTube, there is a video by a professional financer named Basim who discusses exactly why our tax system is designed for the rich to get richer. Basim makes a lot of really good points in his videos, but to keep things brief, I will just go over the things that are directly relatable to this chart. First, Basim mentions how the upper class generally make their money through capital gains and Canadian dividends, in comparison to the lower and middle class who earn their money through employment income. Now, this is a problem as, specifically when it comes to capital gains, they are taxed half as much as employment income. So, a member of the upper class in the highest tax bracket is taxed roughly 27% on their capital gains, which is comparable to a member of the lower and middle class in the second and third tax bracket who is being taxed the same on their employment income, despite the fact that the person in the second or third tax bracket is making roughly 3 times as less money as the person in the highest tax bracket. Second, Basim discusses how Canadian dividends are easily used to manipulate the tax brackets. For example, a member of the upper class can structure their income tax such that their sole income is roughly $50,000 worth of dividends. This puts them in the second tax bracket, meaning that they are taxed roughly 0% on those dividends. Let's say this person also wanted to get their spouse into the mix. They can give their spouse shares roughly so that they make also around $50,000 in Canadian dividends, also taxed at roughly 0%. Between the two of them, this means that they have a collective income of around $100,000 being taxed at 0%, whereas normally, if this was the income of one person, it'd be taxed at 12%, or if it was the employment income of someone of the middle class, they would be taxed at roughly 33% instead. Like with capital gains, this begs the question, why is the person of the upper class paying so much less in taxes than somebody in the middle class who is making astronomically less? Income tax is just one example of how Canadian systems may lead to or contribute to poverty. Laws against panhandling and loitering actively criminalize those that have nowhere else to go, and those begging for money as the only barrier between them and having to resort to crime. While there are other things like legal representation can be quite expensive in Canada. For those that can't afford it or don't have access to services providing it, then you'll have a hard time fighting for your rights when you're supposed to be guaranteed fair representation. And other things like criminal records. For criminals that have gone through successful rehabilitation, they actively harm them in trying to find economic stability with a job, as not many people want to hire a past criminal. And to answer the original question, humans weigh the benefits and consequences of their actions. Sometimes necessity means that there is only one choice worth taking. It is necessary to commit a crime, therefore the consequences don't matter. Unfortunately, many aspects of society perpetuate and criminalize those acting out of necessity. From this, I've come with a few methods of crime prevention. First, amend legislation like the Income Tax Act that serve to get the rich richer. Instead, we could possibly try a wealth-based tax system. Improve social services and spending to provide for those in need. This is self-explanatory. The best thing that the state could do is provide for those so that they don't have to commit actions that the state themselves has deemed illegal. Help the unemployed find jobs so that they can support themselves. Find housing alternatives so that we don't have to go bankrupt trying to find shelter. And introduce things like wage caps, minimums, and other generalist socialist policy. This may be a personal thing, but I just think that it would really help everyone involved.